October 25, 1944, the Philippine Sea, off Samar Island. The sea is a flat, metallic blue. The air hums. A speck appears on the horizon, low against the water. It grows into a shape, a dark silhouette against the glare, a Japanese Zero, its fixed landing gear giving it a predatory insectal look, but its approach is different. It does not weave or jink, it holds a line straight and unwavering, aimed like a thrown spear at the flank of the U.S. destroyer USS Heermann. On the destroyer, the general quarters gong still echoes. Men scramble. The 40 Bofors mounts and 20 Oerlikon cannons swing toward the incoming plane. The gunners' world narrows to the ring of their sights, their hands slick with sweat and oil. They lead the target, judging speed, distance, and descent in a frantic mental calculus. They open fire. The sky around the Zero blossoms with black, dirty smudges, flak bursts, but they bloom behind it, below it, off to its side. The puffs are close, but not close enough. The gunfire is a wall, but the plane flies through its gaps. The roar of its engine rises to a shriek. The gunners can see the pilot now, a helmeted figure behind the glass, committed to his final trajectory. This was the calculus of death in the Pacific. For years, it favored the man in the cockpit. To kill a plane, a shell had to hit it directly or pass close enough for its contact fuse to sense the impact. Every near miss was a failure. Every burst a few yards off was meaningless. The pilots knew this. They mocked the frantic, inaccurate fire. They dove through storms of steel, betting, often correctly, that the odds were survivable. But on this day, in this moment, a new equation is being written. A 5-inch shell from the Heermann's rear mount screams skyward. It is not aimed to hit the plane, it is aimed to intercept its path. As it spins toward the Zero, it carries not a simple impact fuse, but a tiny, intricate heart of radar and vacuum tubes, sealed with it. The artillery shell's nose, it senses the void. Then, at precisely 70 feet from the diving Zero's wingtip, it senses the reflected radio waves, the change in signal. It detonates. The explosion is not a puff of black smoke. It is a violent, white-orange flash and a sphere of shrapnel that suddenly fills a volume of sky the size of a house. There is no near miss. The Zero flies directly into this expanding cloud of jagged steel. The aircraft disintegrates. One moment it is a diving weapon. The next, it is a cartoonish burst of flame, shattered metal, and torn canvas, its pieces cartwheeling into the sea. The pilot has no time to react. His bet has been catastrophically called. The sky itself has become a weapon, and the war for the Pacific has just changed forever. This is the story of the proximity fuse, a device so secret, its use was forbidden over land for fear of capture. A weapon born not on the battlefield, but in the quiet of American and British laboratories. It was the moment when the terrible efficiency of the machine finally met the chaotic art of aerial warfare, and it began with a crisis that was sinking the United States Navy. To understand the revolution, one must first understand the desperation. The war in the Pacific opened with a seismic shock. December 7, 1941, at Pearl Harbor was not merely an attack on battleships, it was a declaration of a new kind of naval warfare. Japanese carrier-based aircraft, the WWII, had demonstrated a reach and precision previously unimaginable. For months afterward, this dominance was absolute. The sinking of the HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off Malaya days later proved that even a modern, maneuvering battleship task force was helpless without air cover. The message was seared into the consciousness of every Allied sailor: control of the sea now depended on control of the sky. And the United States Navy, in those early, dark months, did not control the sky. Its pre-war anti-aircraft doctrine was exposed as tragically inadequate. Fleet defense relied on a layered system: fighter combat air patrols, CAP, at range, then medium-range 5-inch guns, and finally a close-in curtain of automatic weapons, 1-inch Chicago pianos. 14 Bofors and 20 Oerlikons, the fighters were often outclassed by the agile Mitsubishi A6M0, but it was the gunnery that faced an almost insurmountable physics problem. Hitting a fast-moving aircraft with a shell was described as trying to shoot a hummingbird with a rifle blindfolded from a merry-go-round. The gun director Cruz had to calculate the target's future position based on its observed course, speed, and altitude while compensating for their own ship's pitch, roll, and yaw. This data was fed mechanically to the guns, which fired shells with timed fuses set to explode at a predicted altitude. The margin for error was monstrous. A 1-second miscalculation in fuse timing or a slight error in estimating the target's speed meant the shell would burst hundreds of feet off target, a harmless black puff in an empty sky. The close-range weapons demanded superhuman skill and nerve, a 20-Oerlikon gunner staring through his ring sight at a plane diving directly at him at over 300 knots had to lead the target, firing not at it but at where it would be. He felt every vibration of his ship, every flinch of his own body, translated into a wild spray of tracers that seemed to curve away from the enemy. Japanese pilots, highly trained in battle, hardened from the war in China, learned to recognize the patterns of this flak. They would weave, climb, and dive at the last moment, exploiting the lag in human reaction and mechanical tracking. They developed a visceral contempt for American anti-aircraft fire, seeing it as a frantic, noisy, but ultimately ineffectual defense. This confidence was not unfounded. In the carrier battles of Coral Sea and Midway in 1942, the U.S. Navy scored its first decisive victories, but they were won by dive bombers and torpedo planes striking first, not by impregnable fleet defense. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942, the carrier USS Hornet was pummeled by swarming Japanese aircraft and ultimately lost. The sky above the task forces remained a lethal permeable space. A single determined pilot could, and often did, slip through the storm of steel to deliver a bomb or a torpedo that could cripple a capital ship. The U.S. Navy was winning, but it was bleeding. Each victory was costly, and a darker, more desperate Japanese tactic was looming on the horizon, one that would exploit this very vulnerability with fanatical precision. The stage was set for a crisis that would demand a technological answer, an answer being forged in utmost secrecy under the name Section T and in British laboratories known simply by a deceptively bland codename, the VT or Variable Time Fuse. By 1944, the strategic tide had turned against Japan. The Allied island-hopping campaign was carving a path toward the home islands. American industrial might was pouring into the Pacific in the form of new Essex-class fast carriers, Iowa-class battleships, and a seemingly endless fleet of support vessels. But this very strength presented a new kind of vulnerability. Mass. The U.S. 5th and 3rd Fleets were colossal armadas, their profiles darkening the horizon. To the Japanese high command, these fleets were not just targets, they were symbols of an enemy that could not be out-produced, only out-sacrificed. From this doctrine of desperation emerged the most terrifying threat to American sailors. Yet the Tokubetsu Kojikatai, the Special Attack Unit, the world would know them as the Kamikaze, the Divine Wind. The first organized kamikaze attacks were launched during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. The tactic was brutally simple. A pilot, often in an obsolete or lightly built aircraft, sometimes loaded with extra explosives, would dive his plane directly into an Allied ship. This was not a bombing run with a chance of escape. It was a guided missile with a human brain at the controls. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Traditional evasive tactics were meaningless. A pilot aiming for a ship, not avoiding fire, was a radically different and more lethal problem. He became a closing weapon, his intentions clear, his path a predictable line only in its final, deadly commitment. For the gun crews, it was a nightmare evolution of their old enemy. Before, they faced skilled pilots trying to avoid them, to drop a weapon and flee. Now they faced skilled pilots seeking only to join with them in a fiery union. The closing speed was appalling. The window for engagement shrank from minutes to seconds. A plane could be spotted on the horizon and in a terrifyingly short time be in its final dive, the wall of fire. Doctrine, which relied on saturating an area of sky, was strained to its breaking point. You could fill the air with steel, but a human-guided weapon, steeped in fatalistic resolve, could find the gap. The U.S. Navy's kill ratio began to drop alarmingly. Ships that had survived furious conventional battles were being damaged or sunk by single, determined aircraft. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the calculating architect of the victory at Midway, observed the threat with cold clarity. The fleet's existing anti-aircraft umbrella, while improved by radar-directed gunlaying and more weapons, was fundamentally reactive. It was a shield being struck by a hammer with increasing force and frequency. The casualty reports flowing into Pearl Harbor and Washington told a stark story. The closer the U.S. moved to Japan, the more intense and personally sacrificial the air attacks became. Projections for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, predicted losses of ships and sailors on an almost unimaginable scale, primarily from kamikaze attacks. It was within this gathering storm that a secret weapon, 3 years in the making, was finally released from its doctrinal shackles. Initially, the use of the proximity fuse had been restricted to naval engagements, where a dud or a recovered sample could not fall into enemy hands. It was used over the open ocean, with great effect but under tight controls. The kamikaze threat changed the calculus. Conservation of a secret was weighed against the immediate conservation of the fleet. The order went out. The VT fuse was to be employed liberally in fleet defense, shells that could sense their target, that turned near misses into certain kills, were no longer a tactical advantage to be hoarded. They were a necessity for survival. The stage was now set for a collision between an ancient ethos of warrior sacrifice and a new pinnacle of automated electronic warfare, the mocking confidence of Japanese aviators born in the early victories, was about to meet a silent, unseen countermeasure that made the very air around their aircraft lethal. The battle would not be decided by courage. Both sides had that in abundance, but by the relentless, impersonal logic of the machine. This collision would reach its crescendo in the vast naval battles of late 1944 and 1945, where the sky would cease to be an empty medium to traverse and become, for the attacking pilot, a domain saturated with intelligent, waiting death. Crammed into the open tub of a 40 Bofors mount or braced behind the chattering barrel of a 20 Oerlikon, the anti-aircraft gunner lived in a world of violent noise, acrid smoke and brutal mathematics. His was the last line of defense. Once a plane broke through the fighters and the 5-inch barrage, it was in his hands. His tool was a mechanical computer of muscle, nerve, and instinct. He tracked the target through his ring sight, a trembling circle of iron against a sky filled with confusion, tracers, flak, and the dark, growing shape of the enemy. He had to calculate lead, the forward allowance needed for the target to fly into his stream of shells. He had to sense his ship's roll, firing at the crest to maximize range, all while the plane, a screaming silhouette, grew larger in his vision with terrifying speed. For the kamikaze, the calculation was different and simpler. He was not trying to avoid the stream, he was trying to intersect with the ship. This turned the gunner's art into a desperate race. Before, a pilot might break off. Now he only pressed closer. The gunner saw the face of his own death approaching and knew his weapon's limitations. Intimately, he saw his tracers, bright lines in the sky seeming to curve behind the target. He felt the heat of his own barrel, the empty brass piling around his feet. He knew that despite the storm he was creating, it was a storm with holes, a statistical curtain, and one plane, one time, needed only one hole. His success was measured in the shuddering impact of a bomb, or the terrifying final silence when the diving engine cut out, the sign of a committed suicide attack. It was a psychological torment layered upon a physical task of immense difficulty. The confidence of Japanese naval aviators in the early war was not mere bravado. It was hard-earned and empirically proven. Flying the phenomenally agile Mitsubishi A6M, they had outperformed Allied fighters across the Pacific against anti-aircraft fire. They developed an almost intuitive understanding of its rhythms. They learned to watch the muzzle flashes of the ships to time the salvos. They understood that the heavy 5-inch guns fired in patterns, with lulls for reloading and recalibration. They would climb, dive, and jink, using their aircraft's light weight and responsiveness to slip through the gaps in the flak pattern. This skill bred a profound sense of superiority. In debriefings and diaries, pilots spoke of American flak as aim, or rain, something to be flown through, an annoyance that soaked you but did not kill you. They mocked the wild, uncoordinated firing of the early war crews. This confidence became a core part of their tactical identity, even as the quality of American gunnery improved with radar direction and central fire control. The underlying principle remained: you could evade a shell aimed to hit you. This ethos carried directly into the Kamikaze era. The final dive was not a surrender to fate, but the ultimate expression of piloting skill, holding a steady course through the most intense fire, a last demonstration of nerve and precision to place their aircraft, now a bomb. With exacting accuracy, they were betting their lives, as they always had, on the inaccuracy of the guns. It was a bet that had paid off for years. The problem of the missed miss had haunted artillerymen since World War I. In the late 1930s, as war loomed, researchers in Britain and the United States independently began chasing the same radical idea: a fuse that could sense its target. The British, under the Ministry of Supplies, Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, the so-called Weezers and Dodgers, made crucial early strides with a miniature radio transceiver, but it was the Americans, through a Herculean effort coordinated by the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, who industrialized the concept. The task was staggering. They had to miniaturize a working radio set with a vacuum tube transmitter, receiver, and battery, small enough to fit in the nose of a 5-inch shell, rugged enough to survive being fired from a naval gun at 20,000 gs of force, and cheap enough to be produced by the tens of thousands. The team, led by physicist Merle Tuve at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, then known as Section T, worked in parallel on every component. They created vacuum tubes with hair-thin filaments that could withstand the shock. They developed batteries using a liquid electrolyte that would activate only during the shell's spin. They engineered plastics and alloys to protect the delicate electronics. By late 1942, they had a working model. It was a masterpiece of miniaturization and ruggedization. Once fired, the shell's spin would activate the battery and power up the tiny radar set. It would continuously emit a radio signal as it approached any solid object, an aircraft wing, a fuselage. The reflected signal would create a critical chain in the circuit, triggering the detonator at the optimal distance. It rendered the complex calculations of timed fuses obsolete. The shell now had a primitive electronic brain. Its official name was the VT, or Variable Time Fuse. Its existence was one of the best kept secrets of the war, guarded even more closely than the atomic bomb project. For to use it was to risk its discovery, and its magic lay in its mystery. The introduction of the VT fuse did not simply improve accuracy, it fundamentally rewrote the doctrine of naval anti-aircraft defense. Prior to its arrival, fleet air defense was a layered, probabilistic endeavor. The goal was to create a curtain or box of flak through which an aircraft had to fly, hoping that statistical chance would place it in the path of a fragment. It was area denial. The VT fuse transformed this into a system of precision extermination. Each 5-inch shell now possessed its own lethal sphere of influence, roughly 70 feet in radius. An aircraft did not have to be hit, it only had to pass within this invisible, electronic bubble. This changed gunlaying from an art of prediction to one of simple pointing, fire control. Directors no longer had to compute the complex future intersection, point of shell, and target for fuse timing. They now aimed for an intercept course, knowing that as long as the shell passed reasonably close, the fuse would do the rest. The rate of kill per shell fired skyrocketed. A post-war analysis would show that it took an average of over 2,000 rounds of conventional 5-inch ammunition to shoot down one aircraft. With the VT Fuze, that number plummeted to fewer than 100. The psychological impact on gun crews was immediate. The frantic, hope-laden desperation of watching their bursts explode behind a diving plane was replaced by the awe of seeing aircraft simply disintegrate as they neared the fleet. For Japanese pilots, encountering massed VT fuse fire for the first time was a profoundly disorienting and demoralizing experience. The old rules were void. The patterns of evasion they had mastered were suddenly useless. An aircraft could be performing a perfect weaving approach and still be obliterated by a shell that burst not where it was, but where it was going to be. There were no near misses anymore, only hits or catastrophic detonations. Pilots who survived initial encounters reported back with confusion and dread. They spoke of shells that followed them or of an uncanny accuracy that made the sky itself feel hostile. This technological shock had a corrosive effect on morale, even within the fatalistic framework of the Kamikaze. While the Tokubetsu Kojkitai pilots were resolved to die, their mission's success was predicated on achieving a hit. The VT fuse severed the link between their sacrifice and a guaranteed result. Now, a pilot could commit to his final dive with unwavering spirit, only to be annihilated hundreds of yards from his target. His death rendered tactically meaningless. The weapon they were told would pierce the enemy's material strength was being neutralized by a silent, invisible countermeasure they could neither see nor understand. Intelligence reports and intercepted communications began to note a new, grim assessment creeping into Japanese evaluations. The American fleet's defenses had become impenetrable. The story of the VT fuse is not only one of invention, but of staggering industrial production and disciplined secrecy. By 1944, the Crosby Company of Buffalo, New York, a former manufacturer of refrigerator parts, had become the epicenter of fuse production, eventually turning out over 1 million units. The delicate electronic components, once hand-assembled by scientists, were now produced on automated lines by a workforce largely composed of women. Each fuse was a minor miracle of mass production, built to tolerances unheard of for what was essentially disposable ordnance. Getting these fuses to the fleet and ensuring their proper use was a clandestine operation of immense scale. The fuses were shipped in crates marked with special restricted codes. They were stored separately from conventional ammunition aboard ship under the control of specially briefed officers. Gunnery crews were trained in their handling. They were to be treated with the care of a laboratory instrument until loaded into the breech. But the PRECISE Chinese letter WS, a closely held secret. This blanket of secrecy was so effective that, despite the fuse's widespread use from late 1943 onward, Japanese intelligence never fully grasped its nature. They attributed the devastating accuracy to an improvement in American radar fire control, a misunderstanding that persisted until after the war. The veil of mystery was as vital to the weapon's success as its circuitry. The convergence of these 6 angles, the gunner's desperation, the pilot's confidence, the scientist's genius, the tactical revolution, the enemy's confusion, and the industrial machine created the conditions for a decisive, violent shift. That shift would first manifest in a colossal carrier battle where the new weapon would be unleashed not in desperation, but in a calculated demonstration of overwhelming defensive power. June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas, Turkey. Judo. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, a behemoth of 15 carriers and hundreds of support vessels under Admiral Raymond Spruance, lay between the invading American forces on Saipan and The approaching Japanese mobile fleet. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's plan was elegant. Theory used the superior range of his aircraft to launch long-range strikes, recover and rearm them on Guam and strike again, all while staying beyond the reach of American carriers. He launched 4 massive raids throughout the day, the sky filled with over 300 Japanese aircraft, a seemingly overwhelming wave of naval air power. American radar picked up the incoming formations at extreme range from the flight decks of the Essex, Yorktown, and Lexington. F-6F Hellcats scrambled, climbing to intercept. What followed was an immense aerial slaughter, the Great Marianas Turkey shoot, as the superior Hellcats tore into the less experienced Japanese formations. But not every plane could be stopped by fighters, leakers, individual aircraft, or small groups always slipped through, beginning their death dives toward the valuable carriers and battleships below. This was the moment the VT Fuze had been waiting for. For months, it had been used cautiously, primarily by the fast battleships in task force screens, but here, facing the largest carrier-borne air assault since Pearl Harbor, Spruance authorized its full, unrestricted use. A new order echoed across the fleet's TBS radios: use special ammunition at discretion. As the surviving Japanese aircraft, Vals, Judys, and Kates, pressed home their attacks, they met a new kind of hell: the 5-inch batteries of the screening destroyers, cruisers, and battleships opened up to the Japanese pilots accustomed to weaving through patterns of black puffs. The sight was bewildering and terrifying. Shells no longer burst in predictable sequences behind or around them. They exploded with unnerving accuracy in front of them, among them. The sky ahead of a diving aircraft became a wall of continuous, lethal detonations. Lieutenant J.G. Alexander Vrasiu, a Hellcat ace witnessing the spectacle from above, described it: the Japs were coming in, and the whole task group opened up with 5-inch. I saw planes disintegrate, just fly into this wall of bursts and vanish. The statistics were staggering. Of the 373 carrier-based aircraft Ozawa launched that day, over 240 were shot down by fighters, but of the remainder that pressed on toward the fleet, a huge proportion were annihilated by anti-aircraft fire of a previously unimaginable efficiency. The destroyer USS Charette alone reported using VT fuses to destroy 4 attackers in minutes. The battleship USS Alabama's logs noted unprecedented accuracy from its 5-inch batteries. By day's end, Japanese naval air power had been gutted, losing over 500 aircraft and hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. American losses were a fraction of that. The battle was a decisive victory, but its true turning point was hidden in the technical logs. The VT Fuze had passed its ultimate operational test. It had proven it could defend a massed fleet against a coordinated, large-scale attack. It had moved from a secret weapon to a battle-winning system. Yet the most brutal test was still to come. The Japanese, reeling from this catastrophic conventional defeat, would abandon complex carrier tactics altogether. Their response would not be a new strategy, but a deeper descent into sacrificial warfare, setting the stage for an even more harrowing confrontation, where the proximity fuse would become not just a weapon of victory, but a shield for survival. October 1944, April 1945, the Kamikaze storm and the electronic wall. The shattering defeat at the Philippine Sea left the Imperial Japanese Navy with carriers that were empty hulls, devoid of aircraft, and more critically, skilled aviators. As the American invasion of the Philippines began at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan's answer was the Tokubetsu Kojgatai. The Kamikaze was born from tactical bankruptcy, but it presented a problem of terrifying simplicity and psychological intensity that threatened to overwhelm even the improved U.S. defenses. The first major waves hit during the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 25, 1944, a date later called the Battle off Samar. The slow escort carriers of Task Unit 7743, Taffy 3, found themselves under assault not only by surface warships, but by swarming Kamikazes. In these chaotic, close-range fights, the VT Fuze proved its worth under the most desperate conditions. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, fighting a legendary gun duel with heavy cruisers, also used her single 5-inch mount with VT Fuses to break up incoming air attacks, buying precious minutes for the carriers. But the attacks were relentless. The carrier USS St. Lo was struck by a single kamikaze and sunk, a stark demonstration that the threat was existential. This crisis triggered a fundamental shift in U.S. Navy tactical doctrine and the full, unfettered release of the VT Fuze stockpile. The order was clear: every 5-inch gun in the fleet was to be supplied with a high percentage of VT shells. The goal was no longer merely to shoot down aircraft, but to create an impenetrable electronic bubble around high-value units, particularly the troop-packed invasion transports and the vulnerable escort carriers. By the time of the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945, Operation Iceberg, the system was refined to a grim science. The U.S. fleet assembled was the largest in history. Prime target for the Kikusui floating chrysanthemum mass kamikaze attacks. The defense was organized in layered rings, combat air patrols of Hellcats and Corsairs operated at the outermost perimeter. Then came the radar picket line, a chain of destroyers and smaller vessels stationed dozens of miles from the main fleet, acting as early warning and the first line of anti-aircraft defense. These picket ships were sacrificial lambs drawing the fiercest attacks. They became the crucible where the VT Fuze fought its most brutal battle. Stationed on the picket line, a destroyer like the USS Laffey found itself at the epicenter of the storm. On April 16, 1945, Laffey endured an 80-minute nightmare, attacked by 22 kamikazes and 10 conventional bombers. Her gunners fought with a mechanical fury. Her 5-inch mounts, fed by a continuous stream of VT-fused ammunition, fired until the barrels glowed. The action reports read like a clinical catalog of the new warfare. Plane destroyed by VT Fuze burst at 500 yards. Aircraft disintegrated by proximity. Burst off port bow. Suicide plane destroyed 200 yards astern, time and again diving. Aircraft were shattered into flaming debris well short of the ship. Laffey was hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs, a testament to the sheer volume of the attack, but she survived. She did so because the VT Fuze had drastically thinned the wave, destroying perhaps a dozen other attackers before they could impact. Her survival was not a miracle of evasion, but a testament to the calculated, automated lethality of her primary anti-aircraft battery. Across the fleet at Okinawa, the story repeated itself. The kill ratios were stark. While the kamikaze campaigns sank or damaged hundreds of ships, the vast majority of attacking aircraft were destroyed. Post-battle analysis credited the VT Fuze with being responsible for approximately 50% of all aircraft kills during the Okinawa campaign, a figure that climbs higher for kills achieved at the critical medium-range envelope, the sky around. The fleet was, quite literally, turned into a maelstrom of shrapnel. A Japanese pilot's chance of penetrating to a major capital ship plummeted. The weapon designed to counter the skilled, evasive pilot of 1942 had become the perfect answer to the determined, unevading pilot of 1945. The turning point was not a single battle, but the relentless, grinding application of a technological solution that systematically invalidated the enemy's chosen form of sacrifice. The confident mockery of early war pilots had been silenced, replaced by the near certainty of an anonymous, electronic death long before their sacrifice could bear fruit. The climax of this technological struggle was not a dramatic ship-to-ship duel, but the sight of a kamikaze erupting into a fireball hundreds of yards from its target, its pilots. Resolve defeated not by courage, but by a tiny, whirring device that had already decided his fate milliseconds before. The human wave was breaking against an electronic wall. The raw arithmetic of the proximity fuse impact tells a story of devastation. Prior to its Widespread deployment in late 1944, U.S. Navy anti-aircraft gunnery, while improved, still required an enormous expenditure of ordnance for each kill. The VT Fuze changed that equation by an order of magnitude. A declassified U.S. Navy report concluded that the Fuze was between 5 to 10 times more effective than the best combination of radar-directed gunlaying and timed fuses. In the crucible of the Kamikaze campaign, this multiplier was the difference between a beleaguered defense and a sustainable one. During the Okinawa campaign alone, it is estimated the Fuses were responsible for destroying between 250 and 300 enemy aircraft that would have otherwise likely penetrated to the fleet. Each one of those was a potential ship sinking or ship crippling event averted. The psychological aftermath on the Japanese military was profound and corrosive. Pilot testimonials and intercepted communications reveal a growing sense of helplessness and technological awe. A captured Japanese flight officer after Okinawa stated, "Your anti-aircraft fire has become almost perfect. It seems you have a new type of shell, which is very effective. Our planes are often destroyed before they can even begin their dive." This was the ultimate demoralizer, a weapon that negated skill and sacrifice alike. The Kamikaze, conceived as the great psychological and tactical equalizer, was being rendered tactically obsolete by a device its users did not understand: the relentless attrition of aircraft and pilots, now dying with diminishing tactical effect, accelerated the hollowing out of Japan's already crippled air arms. The very tactic born from desperation was being systematically dismantled by a cooler, more calculated form of ingenuity. For the U.S. Navy sailor, the effect was transformative. The constant, grinding anxiety of the kamikaze threat, the feeling of waiting as a fixed target for a guided human missile, was mitigated by a new and potent confidence in the fleet's defenses. Gun crews, once praying for a lucky hit, now watched their fire with an expectation of success. The morale reports from ships equipped with ample VT fuses noted a significant boost in crew confidence. They were no longer merely hoping to deter, they knew they could destroy. This shift in mindset was a tangible force multiplier. It allowed ships to hold station, to continue providing vital air cover and fire support to troops ashore, without being forced into constant, fuel-wasting evasion. The VT Fuze turned the fleet's anti-aircraft screen from a porous shield into a hard, reactive armor. The strategic consequence was immense. The fearsome casualty projections for the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, which anticipated thousands of ships lost or damaged primarily to kamikaze attacks, were based on pre-VT Fuze defense models. While the invasion would have remained a bloody ordeal, the proven effectiveness of the Fuze in the spring and summer of 1945 provided Allied planners with the assurance that the fleet could sustain itself and provide support in the face of the expected fanatical aerial onslaught. It was one of several key factors, alongside the atomic bomb and Soviet entry, that shaped the endgame of the Pacific War, convincing both American planners and the Japanese high command that the cost of continued resistance would be cataclysmic, with diminishing returns for their most devastating defensive weapon. The secret of the Fuze, so fiercely guarded, was kept until the very end. Not a single intact model was captured by Axis forces. Its existence remained a mystery, a hidden pillar of Allied victory. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the story of the VT Fuze transitioned from a battle-winning secret to a cornerstone of modern military technology. The scientists and engineers of Section T and the Applied Physics Laboratory did not disband. They became the nucleus of a permanent revolution in guided warfare. The miniaturized radar, rugged vacuum tubes, and power systems developed for the Fuze provided the foundational technology for a new generation of weapons, surface-to-air and air-to-air missiles. The concept of a proximity sensor became standard, evolving from radio waves to lasers and other advanced methods. The Fuze itself continued to be refined, its Post-war descendants remain in the arsenals of nations today, a silent, intelligent guardian in artillery shells against both aircraft and, later, incoming missiles and rockets. For the men who faced the Kamikaze, the Fuze left a complex legacy of gratitude and grim acknowledgement. Veterans of the destroyers on the Okinawa picket line spoke of it. With a reverent practicality, it was the tool that allowed them to see another sunrise. But their memories were also haunted by the sheer volume of the attacks and the knowledge that even this technological marvel had its limits. Ships were still hit, friends were still lost. The Fuze did not make them invulnerable. It made survival possible amidst an unprecedented storm of targeted violence. It represented not the end of danger, but the tipping of the odds just enough in their favor to endure. For Japan, the aftermath was one of sobering revelation. During the war, their technical intelligence had conjectured that the Americans had developed an advanced form of radar-directed gunlaying, or perhaps a new kind of time fuse. The truth uncovered during the post-war occupation and analysis was more shocking. They had been defeated in part by a device that fitted a complete radar set inside an artillery shell. Feat of miniaturization and mass production they had not believed possible. This understanding deepened the narrative of technological inferiority that shaped Japan's post-war identity and its subsequent monumental focus on electronics, miniaturization, and precision engineering in the decades that followed. Perhaps the most profound, yet unspoken, aftermath was the philosophical shift the VT Fuze signaled in the nature of warfare. It marked a decisive step away from the individual skill of the gunner and the pilot, and toward automated, sensor-driven systems. The kill chain was shortened and handed over to machines. The pilot's evasive artistry, the gunner's instinctual lead, these human variables were being systematically removed from the equation. Warfare was becoming a contest of engineering, production, and data. The sky over the Pacific in 1945 was one of the first battlefields where this new reality became dominant. The human element remained in the courage to sail into harm's way, in the resolve to dive a plane into a ship, but the decisive moment of interception was increasingly dictated by the cold, flawless logic of circuitry and radar waves. This transition from the art of gunnery to the science of guided interception forms the direct technological lineage to the automated defense systems of the 21st century. It was a quiet revolution, hidden inside a shell casing, that began by saving a fleet and ended by changing the fundamental relationship between man and machine in combat. The story of the proximity fuse is a testament to a different kind of victory, not one solely on the courage of the infantryman or the daring of the pilot, though those were present in abundance, but one forged in the silent, focused light of the laboratory and the relentless rhythm of the production line. It is a narrative that sits at the precise intersection of human desperation and human ingenuity when faced with a threat that exploited the very limits of human reaction and skill. The kamikaze pilot transforming himself into a guided missile. The answer was not to find a better human, but to build a better machine. The technological leap was breathtaking, but its true genius was in its application. It was not merely a new weapon, but a new layer of intelligence bestowed upon an old one. The 5-inch shell, a brute force projectile, became a thinking entity, granted the singular, deadly purpose of sensing life and extinguishing it. In doing so, it turned the vast, empty sky into a calibrated killing field, the mocking confidence of the early war. Japanese aviator, earned through years of aerial mastery, was ultimately rendered obsolete not by a superior warrior, but by a superior circuit. Yet to view this solely as a cold triumph of technology is to miss its deeper resonance. Every VT Fuze detonation that shredded a diving aircraft hundreds of yards from a ship was not just a tactical victory. It was the preservation of a crew, a ship, a family's hope. It represented a shift from passive vulnerability to active defense in the face of a horrifying new form of warfare. the sky, once a medium of terror for the sailor below, was reclaimed. In the end, the legacy of this tiny, devastating device is woven into the fabric of modern conflict. It announced the dawn of the electronic battlefield, where sensors and software begin to dictate the terms of engagement. It stands as a permanent reminder that the course of war and history can be altered not just by the strategies of generals or the grit of soldiers, but by the quiet, determined work of scientists and engineers solving an impossible problem. They turned the very air into shrapnel, and in doing so helped turn the tide of a war.